I call Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to take a call on this, the Customs and Excise Prohibition of Imports Made by Slave Labour Amendment Bill. And I want to acknowledge the member that has brought the bill to the House, Mr Pene Henare, who I have a lot of respect for. And I see that the Select Committee that I chair, the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee, has been nominated. If the bill does get to the Select Committee, although we have a big work program, I can assure you that we will make time to examine this bill. The purpose of the bill is it prohibits the importation of goods made in whole or in part by slave labour. I guess our key messages would be that it's impossible to physically identify goods made by slave labour, so the effectiveness of this legislation is questionable. The bill therefore makes a mere cosmetic change that, if enacted, would undermine the development of a more effective regime of due diligence, which is undertaken by industry and encouraged by consumers, who these days are very informed in terms of the goods and services that they use. New Zealand's anti-slave labour laws are already in broad consensus with international standards and norms. So the main provisions is that it amends the Customs and Excise Act 1996 by inserting into section 2(1) that slave labour means labour by persons over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. It amends the Customs and Excise Act 1996 by inserting into Schedule 1, after the second item, goods manufactured or produced wholly or in part by slave labour. I guess the main debate points that I would make is that it is clear this issue is something we all struggle with, not just here in New Zealand but around the world, and there is no doubt about the abhorrence of slavery. The problems are many and varied. The traditions of servitude and forced labour in many societies prove to be extraordinarily hard to eradicate. However, we just don't see that this bill is the solution in and itself to a number of these issues. The problems with this bill start with a definition. It is simple if we have a very narrow definition that would be associated with what I call a historical image of, say, slave ships. We can all get have a mental image of the abhorrence of the slave trade and slave ships. But the moment we widen that definition, as the member's bill does, we have some real problems in trying to target what is legitimate and realisable from what is illegitimate. It is deeply in contention by many developing countries, and it would lead to massive disputation were we to proceed down that track. The second fundamental problem behind the definitional issues is that the very success of the spread of economic development and the growth of the global supply chain associated with its compounds are difficult. So many different products from so many different countries are incorporated in a final product, meaning that we've got a very complicated and complex supply chain around the world, with many different countries providing services and products that combine to come together to make one product. The second fundamental problem behind the definitional issue is the spread of economic development. One of those was the production of sugar. I just want to use an example of what I just referred to, and that's the production of sugar. In that high-risk product, which would emerge in numerous foodstuffs, all imported into New Zealand, how would we ever be able to differentiate between products made from this wide definition of slavery and products made simply by poor people? And we know and we understand that all around the world, unfortunately, there's labour markets where people are paid a far lower rate than, for example, our minimum wage here in New Zealand. It is simply impossible for customs officers to physically identify goods made by slave labour. So the effectiveness of this legislation is questionable at best. Manufacturing in the world today is much more complex than it has ever been before. A single product is often made by various parts from various countries with different labour standards. It is merely impossible to identify which aspects of a product might or might not have been made, under which labour standards or in which part of the world. The bill therefore makes a mere cosmetic change that, if enacted, would undermine the development of a more effective regime of due diligence which is undertaken by industry and encouraged by consumers who are informed. It's doubtful whether, if we were to pass the bill into New Zealand, we would be able to police it or make it effective. And whether it would have any effect at all is admirable that we pay attention and give voice to this issue. But I think we need to look for real action that will have a real effect. The bill is unlikely to add to New Zealand's anti-slave labour laws, which are already broadly consistent with international standards today. It must be taken in context of a 21st century world. There is no doubt that any MP in this House would support an action that will have a meaningful effect upon slavery, to prohibit it, to stop it, and to drive it out of countries elsewhere. But this bill will not do that. Manufacturing in the world today is much more complex than it was back in 1930, when the United States originally banned slavery. That legislation was passed in 1930. If we were in the climate of trade law and trade rules of the world that was in place in 1930, then this bill might have had some effect.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to leave the chair. Members, this debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day, and the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Good evening.